The Cursed Gift. My name is Edward Davis. I'm a lawyer, one of the best in Los Angeles, if I say so myself. I've always been the kind of guy who believes in power, success, and control. Ethics? Well, let's just say they're negotiable. As long as I won, nothing else mattered. This story, though, isn't about my victories in the courtroom. It's about the one time I lost everything, in fact. It all started with a peculiar gift from one of my wealthiest clients. A man named Arthur Grayson was accused of corporate embezzlement, but I managed to secure a not guilty verdict for him, thanks to some clever maneuvering. After the trial, Arthur approached me with a strange smile on his face. "Edward, you've given me a new lease on life. Let me give you something in return, something you'll never forget," he said. The next day, I received a package at my office. Inside was a small doll, crudely made of straw and fabric. Its black button eyes stared back at me, and its stitched red mouth curved into a crooked grin. Alongside it was a note that read, "My gratitude knows no bounds. Use this wisely." I chuckled. It looked like some sort of artsy trinket, maybe something Arthur picked up on a trip abroad. I placed the doll on a shelf in my home office, between my law books and trophies, and didn't think much of it. That night, I woke up to a faint scratching noise coming from my office. At first, I thought it was just the wind or maybe the old pipes. But when I checked, everything seemed fine. The doll was still sitting on the shelf, exactly where I'd left it. The next day, I got a call that startled me. Henry Martin, a rival lawyer who had always been a thorn in my side, was hospitalized after a car accident. He'd broken both legs and would be out of work for months. The news made me smile. Less competition in the courtroom. But something about it felt off. The timing was almost too convenient. A few nights later, while working late in my office, I found myself fiddling with the doll absent-mindedly. I twisted its straw arm as I thought about a difficult case. The next morning, I learned that a stubborn client of mine, one who had been refusing to pay my fees, was rushed to the hospital with food poisoning. Coincidence? Maybe. But as the incidents piled up, I started to see a pattern. Every time I manipulated the doll, something happened to someone in my life. Curiosity got the better of me, and I started researching. That's when I stumbled upon stories about voodoo dolls, objects said to give their owners power over others. At first, I dismissed it as superstition, but deep down I knew there was something about this doll that defied explanation. Over the next few weeks, I began testing the doll's limits. A court clerk who always made my life difficult slipped and broke his arm after I gave the doll's arm a slight twist. A rival attorney who mocked me at a conference was struck by a freak accident the very next day. The doll was no joke, it was real power. At first it felt exhilarating. For a man who thrived on control, this was the ultimate tool. But with power came paranoia. The nightmares started soon after. In my dreams, I saw a dark figure watching me from the corner of my room. Its eyes were black buttons, just like the doll's. It never moved, but I could feel its presence, heavy and oppressive. I began hearing whispers in the dead of night, whispers that seemed to come from the doll itself. More, it seemed to say. You need more. One night I woke to find the doll sitting on my desk, even though I was sure I'd left it on the shelf. My heart raced as I realized that this was no longer something I could control. The power I'd wielded so recklessly was now turning against me. Things escalated quickly. My victories in court felt hollow as my personal life fell apart. Friends avoided me, claiming I gave off a weird vibe. My health began to deteriorate. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. The doll's influence seeped into every corner of my life. Desperate, I tried to destroy the doll. I threw it into my fireplace, hoping the flames would consume it. But as soon as the fire touched the doll, a deafening scream echoed through the room. It wasn't human, it was something far worse. The flames died instantly, and the doll lay there, untouched. That's when I felt it, an excruciating pain in my chest, as if my heart were being crushed. The dark figure from my nightmares appeared before me, its button eyes glowing like embers. It spoke in a voice that rumbled like thunder. You thought you could use me without paying the price? Now, you are mine.
Next morning, Edward's cleaning staff found him slumped in his office chair, lifeless. His face was twisted in an expression of utter terror, his hands frozen mid-clutch at his chest. The coroner would later list the cause of death as a heart attack, but those who saw the scene whispered about something far more sinister. On Edward's desk sat the doll. Its button eyes gleamed in the sunlight, and its stitched mouth seemed wider than before, as if it were laughing. The cleaning crew refused to touch it, and when the authorities arrived, the doll was gone. No one could explain how it disappeared. Over time, rumors began to spread. Some claimed they saw the doll in pawn shops, antique stores, or even sitting on the shelves of unsuspecting new owners. Each story ended the same way, with tragedy and loss. The house where Edward once lived was sold, but future occupants always complained of cold spots and the feeling of being watched. The office where he died remains empty to this day, the door locked, as if keeping something contained within. And as for the doll, no one knows where it is now. But one thing is certain, it's out there, waiting for its next victim.
The Dark Inheritance. My name is Emily Carter. I'm a small-town girl from Ohio, and up until last year, I lived a perfectly normal life. That changed when I inherited my grandmother's old house after her passing. She had always been a mysterious figure in our family, and her death brought more questions than answers. I never expected that a simple house, and what was inside it, could ruin my life. My grandmother, Margaret, was what some might call eccentric. She lived alone on the outskirts of town in a creaky old house surrounded by dense woods. Growing up, I didn't visit often, and when I did, I felt uneasy. There was always an air of something unspoken. My mum never explained why we kept our distance, but after inheriting the house, I would come to understand. After Margaret's funeral, I drove out to her house to begin sorting through her belongings. It was exactly how I remembered. The air smelled of old wood and something faintly metallic, and the floorboards groaned with every step. The place was cluttered with strange trinkets, dusty books, and jars filled with God knows what. While exploring the attic, I found a locked chest buried beneath stacks of old newspapers. Curious, I pried it open with a crowbar. Inside was a single item, a doll. It was made of cloth, with glass eyes that seemed too real, and a crooked, stitched smile. A shiver ran down my spine as I picked it up. For reasons I couldn't explain, the doll made me uneasy. It felt like it was watching me. At first, I dismissed it as my imagination. It was just an old doll, right? I decided to bring it downstairs and leave it on a shelf in the living room. I didn't want to throw it away. It had been my grandmother's after all. But something told me it didn't belong in the attic. That night, I stayed in the house for the first time. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the occasional creak of the house settling. As I lay in bed, I dreamed of my grandmother. In the dream, she sat in her rocking chair holding the doll. Her eyes were hollow, and she kept whispering, "You shouldn't have brought it down. It needs to stay hidden." I woke up drenched in sweat, the words echoing in my mind. Dismissing it as a nightmare, I went downstairs for a glass of water. That's when I noticed the doll. I had left it on the shelf in the living room, but now it was sitting on the floor, facing the staircase. My heart skipped a beat. I was alone in the house, so how could it have moved? I convinced myself it must have fallen, though deep down, I knew better. Over the following days, strange things started happening. Doors would open and close on their own. I'd hear faint whispers at night, always just out of earshot. The doll seemed to change positions when I wasn't looking, though I tried to rationalize it as forgetfulness. But the unease grew with each passing day. One evening I noticed something chilling. The crooked smile on the doll's face seemed wider. It was subtle at first, but unmistakable. Its glass eyes seemed more focused, as if it was observing me. The air in the house became heavier, making it hard to breathe. It was as if the doll's presence was sucking the life out of the room. Desperate for answers, I started going through my grandmother's belongings. In an old journal, I found an entry that made my blood run cold. It described how she had used the doll in rituals to ward off spirits and protect the family. But the last entry was different. It warned, "The doll has become tainted. It is no longer a protector. It must remain hidden, or it will destroy us." By now, I was barely sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd dream of my grandmother, her whispers growing louder and more frantic. "You have to get rid of it, but not like that. Not like that." One night, I tried to burn the doll in the fireplace. As soon as the flames licked its fabric, a piercing scream echoed through the house. Not human, but something otherworldly. The fire died instantly, leaving the doll untouched. That's when I knew. This wasn't just a cursed object. It was something alive. The whispers grew louder after that. Shadows moved on their own, and I felt an invisible presence watching me at all times. I couldn't stay in the house anymore, but every time I tried to leave, I'd find the doll waiting for me by the door. It was as if it wouldn't let me go. Desperate, I contacted a local historian who specialized in the occult. When I showed her the doll, her face went pale. "You need to return it," she said. "Whatever your grandmother bound to this doll, it's tied to your family. Destroying it will only make it worse. It has to go back to its source." With her guidance, I traced the doll's origins to a clearing deep in the woods behind the house. Underneath an ancient oak tree, I found a circle of stones, exactly as my grandmother had described in her journal. The historian instructed me to place the doll in the center and recite an incantation from the journal. As I spoke the words, the air grew icy. The whispers turned into screams, and the ground beneath the doll began to tremble. The glass eyes glowed faintly, and for a moment I thought it would lunge at me. But as I finished the incantation, everything went silent. The doll collapsed, lifeless. I buried the doll under the stones, covering it with dirt until the clearing looked untouched. As I walked back to the house, I felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. For the first time in weeks, the house felt normal. But even now, I'm not sure if it's truly over. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I wake up with the feeling that I'm being watched. And on rare occasions, I hear faint whispers calling my name. I tell myself it's just my imagination, but deep down I know the truth. The doll may be gone, but its curse lingers, and I can only pray it stays buried.
The Collector. My name is Ryan Thompson, and I've always had a fascination with the macabre. For as long as I can remember, I've been obsessed with collecting strange, dark artifacts, things most people would find creepy or unsettling. Masks, cursed trinkets, ancient talismans. My collection grew to be one of the most impressive among enthusiasts of the bizarre. But no amount of preparation could have readied me for the day I brought that doll into my home. It was at an underground antiques market in New Orleans that I first saw her. A small doll, no larger than a child's forearm, sat on a dusty shelf in a dimly lit corner. She was made of wood and straw, with buttons for eyes and a stitched smile. Her presence was magnetic, almost as if she were waiting for me. The seller was a wiry old man with hollow eyes and a raspy voice. When I asked him about the doll, his expression darkened. "This ain't no decoration," he said. "That doll's got history, and not the good kind." I laughed, thinking it was part of his sales pitch. He hesitated before finally selling her to me. As I walked away, he muttered under his breath, "You've been warned." Back home in Seattle, I proudly added the doll to my collection, placing her on a shelf next to a shrunken head and an old Victorian mirror that supposedly reflected spirits. My friends joked about how creepy the doll was, but I felt oddly protective of her. She fit perfectly with the rest of my collection, or so I thought. That night, as I admired my artifacts, I could have sworn I heard something. It was faint, like the sound of wood creaking or fabric rustling. I chalked it up to the old house settling. But when I turned off the lights and headed to bed, I felt a distinct unease, as if I were being watched. The next few days were strange. Objects in my collection began to move. I'd find books shifted out of place, artifacts knocked over, and, most disturbingly, the doll was never where I left her. I'd place her on the shelf, only to find her sitting on the desk the next morning or propped up against the mirror. At first, I thought I was imagining things, but then the whispers started. Late at night, I'd hear faint murmurs coming from my office. They were low and unintelligible, but undeniably real. When I worked up the courage to investigate, the whispers would stop the moment I entered the room. The doll, of course, was always there, her button eyes gleaming in the dim light. One evening, as I sat at my desk researching her origins, I found myself absent-mindedly holding the doll. I don't remember picking her up, but there she was in my hands. As I examined her closely, I felt a sudden rush of cold air, and my vision blurred for a moment. When it cleared, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. In the reflection of the mirror, the doll wasn't in my hands. Instead, she was sitting on the shelf behind me, watching. I spun around, but there she was, right where I had been holding her. The room felt heavy, and a sense of dread washed over me. I decided to dig deeper into the doll's history. Through hours of research, I discovered stories of dolls like mine, vessels used in rituals to trap spirits or curses. One tale in particular stood out. It spoke of a doll created in New Orleans during the 1800s, intended to imprison the vengeful spirit of a murdered child. The ritual had gone wrong, and the doll became a source of misfortune, bringing death and destruction to anyone who possessed it. I realized too late that the seller's warning wasn't just a sales ploy. The doll wasn't just an artifact. It was alive. The whispers grew louder, turning into laughter that echoed through the house. Shadows moved on their own, and I began to see the doll in my dreams. In one nightmare, I saw myself standing in the middle of a dark room, the doll sitting on a throne of bones. Her button eyes glowed red, and her stitched smile moved as she whispered, "You're mine now." When I woke, I found scratches on my arms, as if something had clawed at me during the night. The doll was on my bedside table, though I was certain I had left her in the office. I knew I couldn't keep her any longer. I tried burning her in the fireplace, but the flames wouldn't touch her. I buried her in the woods, only to find her sitting on my desk the next morning, dirt still clinging to her fabric. Desperate, I contacted a voodoo practitioner in New Orleans who agreed to help. She told me the doll needed to be returned to where she was created and placed in a ritual circle to seal the spirit inside. Without hesitation, I packed the doll and boarded a flight back to New Orleans. The ritual was terrifying. As the practitioner chanted, the doll began to tremble, and the air around us turned icy. Shadows danced across the room, and I heard the same laughter from my nightmares. When the chanting reached its peak, the doll let out a blood-curdling scream before collapsing lifelessly. I left New Orleans that night, feeling like a weight had been lifted. But even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling that something lingers. I hear faint whispers in the dead of night and feel cold spots in my home. I haven't told anyone about the doll since. But if you ever come across an artifact that feels wrong, listen to your instincts. Some objects are better left untouched, and some spirits, once awakened, are never truly gone.
The Black Staff's Revenge. My name is John Barrett, and I used to run one of the most successful farms in rural Kansas. I prided myself on hard work, discipline, and, let's be honest, being tough on my workers. I believed the only way to get results was through fear and control. But what happened to me on that farm, what I brought upon myself, is something I'll never escape. If you've ever thought that curses are just superstition, this story might change your mind. It started with one of my workers, a man named Raymond Parker. He was quiet, the kind of guy who kept to himself, but he had a presence, something in his eyes that made you think twice about crossing him. One day, after I caught him slacking on the job, I let him have it. I threatened to dock his pay, maybe even fire him. Instead of arguing, he just stared at me and said something I'll never forget. "You've got everything you want, but it won't last. Mark my words." He left the farm that same week, and I thought I'd seen the last of him. But that's when the real trouble began. About a month later, I found something strange on my front porch. It was a doll, small, crude, and made of straw, with a black staff tied to its hand. The eyes were tiny black beads, and its mouth was stitched with red thread into a crooked smile. At first, I thought it was some sort of prank. Maybe one of the workers left it there to mess with me. I tossed it into the corner of the porch and went about my day. That night I couldn't sleep. My back ached terribly, as if I'd been carrying a heavy load all day. When I woke up, I found deep scratches on the walls of my bedroom, like claw marks. My first thought was that an animal had gotten into the house, but all the doors and windows were locked. The next day, I found the doll sitting upright on the porch. I knew I hadn't placed it like that. Unease began to creep in, but I convinced myself it was just my imagination. Over the following weeks, things on the farm started going wrong. Crops that had been thriving suddenly wilted. Despite perfect weather and irrigation, animals fell ill and died without explanation. My workers began complaining of strange noises at night, whispers and footsteps in the barn. Then the accidents started. One of my best workers fell from a ladder and broke his leg. Another got his hand caught in a piece of machinery. And all the while, that doll sat on my porch, staring at me with its bead-like eyes. Desperate, I showed it to my neighbor, an older woman named Martha, who was known for her knowledge of local folklore. The moment she saw it, her face turned pale. "Where did you get this?" she asked. I told her about finding it on my porch. Her response chilled me to the bone. "That's a curse," she said, "and it's not just any curse. That staff in its hand, it's a symbol of judgment. Whoever left this for you wanted you to suffer." Martha explained that dolls like this were often used in rituals to bind misfortune to a person. She told me to get rid of it immediately, but warned me that destroying it wouldn't be easy. "Burn it," she said, "but be prepared for resistance." I didn't believe her, but I was desperate enough to try. That night I built a fire in the backyard and threw the doll into the flames. The moment the fire touched it, a piercing scream echoed through the air. It wasn't human. It was something primal, something unnatural. The flames died out almost instantly, and the doll sat in the ashes, completely unscathed. After that night, things got worse. My health began to deteriorate. My back pain grew so severe that I could barely stand some days. I started hearing whispers, low and guttural, coming from the doll. Every time I tried to leave it somewhere, bury it, throw it into the river, it would reappear on my porch the next morning. The farm was in chaos. Workers quit, crops failed, and creditors started calling. I was on the brink of losing everything. In my desperation, I remembered Raymond's words, "It won't last." I realized then that this wasn't just bad luck. It was his doing. Somehow, he had brought this curse upon me. With no other options, I tracked down Raymond. He was living in a rundown trailer on the edge of town. When I confronted him, he didn't deny it. In fact, he seemed almost amused. "You had it coming," he said. "You think you can treat people like dirt and walk away unscathed? The doll's just giving you what you deserve." I begged him to lift the curse, but his expression darkened. "You can't just undo something like this. You want it gone. You have to make things right with the land, with the people you've wronged, and even then, you'll carry the mark." He told me to take the doll back to the farm and bury it where I'd first planted my crops. "Offer it back to the earth," he said. "That's the only chance you've got." That night, I did as Raymond instructed. I took the doll to the center of my field and dug a deep hole. As I buried it, I spoke aloud, apologizing for everything, for my greed, my cruelty, my arrogance. The air grew colder with every word I spoke, and the whispers grew louder, swirling around me like a storm. When the last clump of dirt covered the doll, the ground shook violently, and a deep, guttural laugh echoed across the field. Then everything went silent. For the first time in weeks, I felt a strange sense of peace. John Barrett was never the same after that night. Though the curse seemed to lift, his crops began to grow again, and the whispers stopped. He became a shadow of the man he once was. His back pain persisted, and his health continued to decline. Neighbors would later say they often saw him wandering the fields at night, muttering to himself. Some claimed they heard faint whispers coming from the earth, while others swore they saw a small straw doll sitting at the edge of the field, watching. John sold the farm a year later and disappeared. The new owners never had any problems with the land, but they always wondered about the strange, empty patch in the middle of the field where nothing seemed to grow. And as for the doll, no one knows where it is now, but the whispers say it's still out there, waiting for someone else to disturb its slumber.
The Forbidden Shop. My name is Amanda, and I've always loved hunting for unique finds in vintage shops and antique stores. There's something thrilling about uncovering old treasures that tell stories from the past. But one evening, that love for the unusual led me to a shop that should never have existed. And what I brought home from there, it turned my life into a nightmare. It was a rainy Friday when I stumbled upon the shop. The sign outside was so faded, I could barely make out the words, curiosities and secrets. The windows were coated in grime, and the dim yellow light from inside barely illuminated the interior. I was immediately intrigued. As I stepped inside, a bell above the door jingled, and a musty smell filled my nose. The shelves were packed with oddities, old photographs, antique jewelry, strange carvings, and dusty books in languages I couldn't read. But in the back corner, something caught my eye. A doll, encased in a glass box. The doll was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was small, made of cloth and straw, with button eyes that seemed to glint in the dim light. Its stitched red smile looked slightly off, as if it were mocking me. For reasons I couldn't explain, I felt drawn to it. "Interested in her?" a raspy voice asked behind me, making me jump. I turned to see an old woman, the shopkeeper, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Where did this come from?" I asked, pointing at the doll. The woman hesitated, then said, "She's not for everyone. Some things are best left untouched." Her cryptic warning only fueled my curiosity. "How much?" I pressed. After a long pause, she named a price. It was absurdly low, but she insisted I take it if I was certain. I paid, wrapped the doll in my jacket, and left the shop, feeling an odd mixture of triumph and unease. That night, I placed the doll on a shelf in my bedroom, next to some books and a few trinkets. It looked harmless enough, though its eyes seemed to catch the light in an unsettling way. I laughed at myself for feeling creeped out and went to bed. At around 3 a.m., I woke up with a start. I wasn't sure why at first, but then I heard it, a faint rustling sound. My eyes darted to the shelf where I'd placed the doll. It wasn't there. I found it on the floor, lying face up as if it had fallen. I told myself it must have been the wind, even though the windows were closed. The next morning, I put the doll back on the shelf, determined not to let my imagination get the best of me. But throughout the day, I felt like I wasn't alone in the house. Every time I walked past the shelf, I could have sworn the doll's head had shifted slightly, as if it were following me. That evening, things escalated. While I was cooking dinner, I heard a loud thud from my bedroom. I ran upstairs and found the doll sitting upright on the bed. My stomach dropped. There was no way it could have gotten there on its own. I checked the shelf. It was empty. I should have gotten rid of it then, but a part of me was too curious to let go. I placed it back on the shelf and whispered, "Stay there," as if it could understand me. That night, I had my first nightmare. In the dream, I was standing in my bedroom, unable to move. The doll was sitting on the shelf, staring at me. Then, slowly, it turned its head. Its stitched mouth began to move, and a low, guttural voice whispered, "You brought me here. Now I stay." I woke up drenched in sweat. The doll was still on the shelf, but its head was tilted at an angle I was sure I hadn't left it in. Over the next few days, the activity became impossible to ignore. Doors slammed shut on their own, objects fell off tables, and at night I could hear faint whispers echoing through the house. Every time I tried to move the doll to a different room, it would somehow end up back on the shelf in my bedroom. Desperate for answers, I returned to the shop. But when I arrived, the store was gone. The storefront was boarded up, and there was no sign it had ever been open. I asked a nearby shopkeeper about it, and he looked at me like I was crazy. "That place has been closed for years," he said. "You must be mistaken." My blood ran cold. If the shop wasn't real, then where had I gotten the doll? That night, I tried to throw the doll away. I put it in the trash bin outside and locked the door, hoping that would be the end of it. But when I woke up, it was back on the shelf, its stitched smile wider than before. I started researching dolls like mine and found countless stories about cursed objects, vessels for spirits or entities that attach themselves to people. Many of these stories ended in tragedy. One recurring theme stood out. They choose their owners and won't leave willingly. I knew I couldn't keep living like this. I reached out to a spiritual advisor who agreed to cleanse the doll. When she arrived and saw it, her face turned pale. "This isn't just cursed," she said. "It's bound to you now. If we don't do this right, it could get worse." The ritual involved burning sage, drawing protective symbols and chanting. As she worked, the air in the room grew icy, and a low growl filled the space. The doll began to tremble, and its stitched mouth moved, letting out a sound like laughter. The advisor screamed for me to grab it and throw it into a salt circle she had drawn. As soon as I did, the growling stopped. The doll lay still, lifeless, but I could still feel its presence. After the ritual, I buried the doll deep in the woods and left it there. I haven't seen it since, but sometimes late at night, I hear faint whispers. I tell myself it's just the wind, but I can't shake the feeling that the doll is still watching, waiting for the right moment to return. If you ever come across something that feels wrong, something that makes your skin crawl, don't take it home. Some things are meant to stay hidden, locked away where they can't hurt anyone. Because once you invite them in, they may never leave.
The broken ritual. My name is Lucas, and I've always been skeptical of anything supernatural. Ghost stories, curses, urban legends, they were just entertainment to me. But one night changed everything. What started as an innocent game with my friends turned into a nightmare that still haunts me to this day. It was a Friday night, and my friends, Ethan, Chloe, Sarah, and I, were hanging out at Chloe's place. We were bored, flipping through streaming services for something to watch, when Ethan suggested something different. "Have you ever heard of the old Ouija board trick, but with a twist?" he asked, smirking. We all rolled our eyes. Ethan loved anything spooky, and he was always trying to scare us. But that night, we were restless and curious. "What's the twist?" Sarah asked, half interested. Ethan leaned forward dramatically. "We use a doll instead." Chloe's parents had a box of old toys in the basement, so we went searching for the creepiest one we could find. That's when we stumbled upon it. A small handmade doll with button eyes and a stitched red mouth. It was covered in dust, and one of its arms was slightly torn. It looked like the perfect prop for Ethan's game. We brought the doll upstairs, lit a few candles, and cleared a spot on the living room floor. Ethan explained the rules. We'd place the doll in the center, chant a few lines he'd found online, and ask it questions. It sounded ridiculous, but we were already laughing and teasing each other about who would get scared first. Ethan pulled out his phone and read the chant aloud. It was a strange mix of Latin and gibberish. We all repeated the words, giggling as we did. But as soon as we finished, the laughter stopped. The room felt different, heavier. "Okay, doll," Ethan said, grinning nervously. "If there's a spirit here, give us a sign." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, one of the candles flickered violently before going out. We froze. "It's just the wind," Chloe said quickly, even though all the windows were closed. But then we heard it, a faint scratching sound, like fingernails on wood. It came from the direction of the doll. "What was that?" Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. Ethan, trying to play it cool, laughed nervously. "Probably just a mouse or something." But none of us moved. The scratching grew louder, and the doll's button eyes seemed to glint in the candlelight. Chloe, trying to break the tension, reached out to grab it. "Don't," I said, louder than I intended. Everyone turned to look at me, startled. I didn't know why I'd stopped her, but something deep in my gut told me it was a bad idea. Ethan suggested we end the game. "We'll just say the closing chant, okay? No big deal." But when he pulled up the instructions on his phone, his face went pale. "What's wrong?" Sarah asked. "The instructions are gone," he said, his voice trembling. "They just disappeared." We all stared at him, realizing at the same time that we hadn't properly ended the ritual. That's when the whispers started. They were faint at first, like someone talking just out of earshot. Then they grew louder, filling the room. None of us could understand the words, but they sounded angry. Chloe screamed and pointed at the doll. Its head had turned slightly, its stitched mouth curling upward into a sinister grin. The room grew colder, and the whispers turned into distorted laughter. "We need to get rid of it," Sarah yelled, backing away from the doll. Ethan grabbed it and ran to the backyard, intending to throw it into the fire pit. The rest of us followed, barely able to breathe from fear. But as soon as Ethan tossed the doll into the flames, the fire died out instantly, leaving the doll untouched. "It's not burning!" Ethan shouted, his voice cracking. He stepped back, clutching his hand in pain. A fresh burn mark had appeared on his palm, even though he hadn't touched the fire. We all ran back inside, locking the doors and windows as if that could stop whatever we had unleashed. The doll was still outside, sitting motionless near the fire pit. For a moment, we thought we were safe. But then the scratching started again, this time from inside the house. I turned to look at the living room, and there it was, the doll, sitting on the floor where we'd left it, its button eyes glinting with malice. It hadn't just moved, it had followed us. "What do we do?" Sarah cried, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know," Ethan yelled. "It's not supposed to be real." Desperate, Chloe grabbed the doll and threw it back into the basement. "Stay there!" she shouted, slamming the door shut. The whispers stopped, and the house grew eerily quiet. For the first time all night, we thought it was over. None of us slept that night. We stayed huddled in the kitchen, jumping at every sound. By morning, we decided to leave the house and never speak of what happened again. Chloe's family moved out a few months later, claiming the house was too old and too much work. But we knew the real reason. To this day, none of us talk about that night. Ethan moved to another state. Sarah deleted all her social media and dropped out of college. Chloe and I stayed in touch for a while, but eventually, even we drifted apart. I haven't gone near anything remotely supernatural since. But sometimes late at night, I hear whispers in the corners of my room. And once, I woke up to find a single red thread lying on my pillow. I don't know if the doll is still in that basement, waiting for someone else to find it, or if it followed one of us home.
The family curse. My name is Rachel, and for most of my life, I believed I came from an unlucky family. Strange things always seemed to happen to us. Illnesses, accidents, untimely deaths. My mom used to say, "It's just bad luck, honey." But after she passed away, I found something that made me question everything. A doll. And with it, I discovered the dark truth about my family. After my mom's funeral, I had to sort through her things. She'd lived alone in a quiet suburban house in upstate New York, surrounded by memories she rarely shared. While cleaning out her closet, I came across an old, locked trunk. It looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. Inside, wrapped in a faded cloth, was a doll. It wasn't like any doll I'd seen before. It was small and crude, made of fabric and straw, with glass eyes that seemed to glint even in the dim light. Its mouth was stitched into a crooked line, more unsettling than playful. Something about it gave me chills, but I convinced myself it was just an old keepsake from her childhood. I should have left it there, but instead I brought it home with me. I placed the doll on a shelf in my bedroom, thinking it might be worth something to a collector. That night, I had the most vivid dream. I saw my grandmother, who had died years ago, sitting in a rocking chair with the doll in her lap. She stared at me with hollow eyes and whispered, "You shouldn't have touched it." I woke up drenched in sweat. My heart pounded as I glanced at the shelf. The doll was still there, its glass eyes catching the faint light from the window. I told myself it was just a bad dream. But the next day, I started to notice strange things. The air in my apartment felt heavier, and the doll seemed to shift positions when I wasn't looking. I thought I was imagining it, until I came home from work and found it sitting on my kitchen counter. I was sure I hadn't left it there. Determined to understand why this doll was giving me such a bad feeling, I dug through my mum's belongings again. That's when I found her journal. In it, she had written about the doll and how it had been passed down through generations of women in our family. According to her entries, the doll was used in rituals by my great-grandmother to protect the family from harm. But something had gone wrong. One passage stood out. The doll no longer protects, it takes. Each generation must bear its curse. It cannot be destroyed, only contained. I felt sick to my stomach. Was this why tragedy always seemed to follow us? My mum had hidden the doll, but by taking it, I had unleashed whatever darkness she'd tried to keep locked away. That night, I had another dream. This time, it was my mum sitting in the rocking chair, her face pale and sunken. She clutched the doll tightly and said, "You have to put it back. If you don't, it will destroy you too." I woke up to the sound of something scraping against the floor. The doll was on the other side of the room, sitting upright, as if it had moved on its own. My hands trembled as I picked it up and placed it back on the shelf. But no matter where I put it, the feeling of being watched never went away. Over the next few days, the activity in my apartment escalated. Objects would fall off shelves, lights flickered, and I heard faint whispers in the middle of the night. At first, I thought they were coming from outside, but they always seemed to grow louder when I was near the doll. I reached out to a local historian who specialized in family curses. When I showed her the doll, she gasped and refused to touch it. "This is more than a curse," she said. "This is a vessel. It's tied to your family, but it's also holding something else." She explained that the doll was likely used to trap a spirit or energy, but over the years, it had twisted into something malevolent. "You can't just throw it away," she warned. "You need to return it to where it was first bound." The journal mentioned a clearing in the woods behind my great-grandmother's old house, where the doll had first been used in rituals. I drove there with the doll in a box, my hands shaking the entire time. The clearing was overgrown but still recognizable. At its center was a circle of stones, half buried in moss and dirt. I placed the doll in the center and opened the journal to a passage about reversing the curse. The words were in a language I didn't understand, but I read them aloud anyway. As I spoke, the air grew colder and the forest fell silent. The doll's glass eyes seemed to glow faintly, and the ground beneath it began to tremble. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if something was watching me from the shadows. When I finished the incantation, the wind picked up violently, swirling around the clearing. The doll's stitched mouth opened slightly, and I heard a guttural voice whisper, "You can't escape me." Then, everything stopped. The doll fell limp, lifeless. I buried the doll in the clearing, covering it with dirt and rocks until it was completely hidden. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. Even now, months later, I still feel its presence. Sometimes, I wake up in the middle of the night, certain I hear whispers. And once, I found a single thread of red stitching on my bedroom floor. I don't know if the curse is truly gone, or if it's just waiting. But if you ever come across something that feels wrong, something that gives you that gut-deep sense of dread, do yourself a favor. Leave it alone. Some family secrets are better left buried.
The Cursed Town. My name is Michael Grant, and I'm a journalist. My work has taken me to some strange places, but nothing compares to the abandoned town of Black Hollow. What was supposed to be a simple investigative piece about a ghost town turned into something far more sinister. To this day, I wish I'd never gone there. Black Hollow is a small, forgotten town in the Midwest. It was abandoned decades ago, and no one could explain why. No natural disasters, no economic collapse, just a sudden, eerie exodus. The locals in neighboring towns whispered about curses, but I figured it was just small-town superstition. I was wrong. I arrived in Black Hollow on a cloudy afternoon. The air was unnaturally still, and the silence was oppressive. The streets were lined with crumbling houses, rusted cars, and overgrown weeds. It felt as if time had stopped the moment the last resident left. As I walked through the town square, I noticed a peculiar sight. A single doll sitting on a bench beneath a dead oak tree. It was small, made of fabric and straw, with buttons for eyes and a stitched red mouth. The sight of it sent a chill down my spine, but I brushed it off. Just an old toy, I told myself. I continued exploring, taking notes and snapping pictures. But as the day wore on, a strange feeling crept over me. I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched. Later, as I returned to the square, the doll was gone. My stomach twisted. I was certain I hadn't seen anyone else in the town. I searched the area, but it was nowhere to be found. Shrugging it off as my imagination playing tricks on me, I decided to stay the night. I'd brought camping gear and set up in the remains of the old town hall. As darkness fell, the silence became deafening. It wasn't just the absence of noise. It felt like the town itself was holding its breath. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of faint laughter. It was high-pitched and distant, but unmistakable. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, scanning the empty streets. That's when I saw it. The doll was back, sitting in the middle of the road, staring at me with its button eyes. My first instinct was to leave, but something compelled me to approach the doll. As I got closer, I noticed something strange. There was dirt smeared on its fabric as if it had been dragged across the ground. And then, I heard it. A whisper. It was soft, almost too quiet to hear, but it came from the doll. My blood ran cold. I backed away, stumbling over my own feet, and ran back to the town hall. I locked the doors and sat with my back against the wall, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the wind. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, circling the building, until I realized they weren't coming from outside. They were inside with me. By morning, I was determined to leave. I packed my gear and headed for my car, but it wouldn't start. The engine sputtered uselessly, and the battery was completely dead. Frustrated, I decided to search the town for anything that could help. In the old library, I found a journal left behind by a former resident. Its entries described how the town had been plagued by strange events: crops failing, animals disappearing, and people falling ill. The blame, it seemed, always circled back to the doll. The journal told of a woman named Abigail who had brought the doll to Black Hollow as part of a ritual to protect her family. But something went wrong. The ritual bound the doll to the town, turning it into a vessel for something far darker. One by one, the residents began to leave, driven out by unexplainable horrors. The final entry read, "The doll cannot be destroyed. It will wait for someone new to take its place." Armed with this new knowledge, I decided to confront the doll. I found it sitting in the square again, its crooked smile mocking me. My hands trembled as I picked it up. Its button eyes seemed to gleam with malice, and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. Following the instructions from the journal, I took the doll to the dead oak tree in the center of the square. Beneath its gnarled roots, I found a shallow hole filled with decayed offerings, coins, trinkets, and pieces of fabric. The journal had said to return the doll to its resting place and recite an incantation. As I spoke the words, the air around me grew cold, and the ground beneath my feet began to tremble. Shadows moved unnaturally across the square, and the whispers turned into screams. The doll writhed in my hands, its stitched mouth opening as if to scream. But I didn't stop. I repeated the incantation until everything went silent. The doll fell limp and the shadows receded. The oppressive feeling lifted, but I knew the town would never truly be free. I decided I couldn't leave the doll in Black Hollow. Destroying it was impossible, and leaving it behind felt like handing its curse to someone else. Against my better judgment, I stuffed it into my bag and drove out of town. At first, everything seemed normal. The doll was silent during the drive, and the oppressive feeling from the town began to fade. I started to convince myself that whatever curse it carried was tied to the town, and not to me. But when I got home, the unease returned. That night, as I tried to sleep, I heard it, faint whispers coming from the bag where I had stashed the doll. I turned on every light in my apartment, shaking as I unzipped the bag. The doll was sitting perfectly upright, staring at me with its button eyes. Its stitched mouth had changed. It was now wide open, as if screaming silently. The whispers grew louder, filling the room with an unbearable noise. I grabbed the doll and threw it out the window, watching it land in the street below. But when I turned back toward my bed, it was there, sitting on the pillow. The whispers stopped, replaced by a single clear voice. "You can't get rid of me." The doll has stayed with me ever since. I've tried everything, fire, water, even leaving it miles away. But no matter what I do, it always returns. I've given up trying to escape. It sits on a shelf now, watching me as I write this, its button eyes glinting in the lamplight. I know it's only a matter of time before it decides to do more than just watch.
The caretaker's curse. My name is Hannah. I've worked as a live-in caretaker for years, staying in the homes of the elderly or infirm who need help with daily life. It's not glamorous, but I've always liked the quiet routine. That is, until last year, when I took a job caring for an old woman named Evelyn Harper in her remote Victorian home in Massachusetts. That job changed everything. Evelyn was frail but sharp. Her family had left long ago, and she spent her days alone in her sprawling, decaying house. From the moment I arrived, the place gave me chills. The air inside felt damp and heavy, and the walls were lined with old photographs and peculiar trinkets. Evelyn rarely spoke unless she had to, but one rule she made very clear: stay out of the attic. I thought it was odd, but I respected her wishes. That is, until I heard the noises. It started on my third night in the house. At first, it was just faint creaking, easy to dismiss in an old house like hers. But as the week went on, the sounds became more distinct. Footsteps, whispers. Sometimes I thought I heard a soft laugh, like a child's giggle, but there were no children in the house. One night I finally asked Evelyn about it. Her face darkened. "It's just the house settling," she said curtly. Then she gripped my arm with surprising strength and repeated, "Stay out of the attic." Her tone left no room for argument, but it only made me more curious. A week later, the noises became impossible to ignore. They were louder, more deliberate, as if someone, or something, was walking back and forth above my room. The whispers grew more distinct, though I couldn't make out the words. One night, I couldn't stand it anymore. With Evelyn asleep in her room, I grabbed a flashlight and crept up the stairs to the attic. The air grew colder as I ascended, and my stomach churned with unease. The attic door was locked, but I found the key in a nearby drawer. As I turned it in the lock, The whispers stopped abruptly, plunging the house into an eerie silence. Inside, the attic was cluttered with old furniture, trunks, and cobwebs. But in the center of the room, sitting on a small wooden chair, was a doll. The doll was unsettlingly lifelike, with porcelain skin, glass eyes, and blonde curls that framed its face. Its mouth was painted into a faint smile, but it felt more like a smirk. Around its neck was a string of tiny beads, and its dress was tattered and stained. As I approached, a cold draft swept through the room, even though the windows were shut. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I thought I saw the doll's head tilt slightly. I convinced myself it was my imagination. It was just a doll, after all. But as I turned to leave, I heard a faint whisper, "Don't leave me." I froze. The voice wasn't Evelyn's, and I was alone. When I turned back, the doll's glass eyes seemed to follow me. The next morning, I confronted Evelyn about the attic. Her reaction was immediate and furious. "You went up there?" she shouted, her frail body trembling. "I told you to leave it alone." "I heard something," I said. "There's a doll." "It's not a doll," she snapped, cutting me off. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "It's her." I stared at her, confused. "What do you mean?" Evelyn took a deep breath, her eyes darting toward the ceiling. "That doll belonged to my daughter. She died when she was young, but her spirit never left. It attached itself to the doll." Her voice quivered as she continued. "I locked it away to keep her from hurting anyone. But now that you've gone up there..." She didn't finish the sentence, but I understood. I had disturbed something that wasn't meant to be disturbed. That night, the noises returned, louder than ever. Footsteps echoed in the hall outside my room, and I heard a soft, childlike voice humming a tune. When I opened the door, the hallway was empty, but a faint giggle trailed off toward the attic. I decided to check on Evelyn, only to find her bedroom door ajar. Inside, she was sitting upright in bed, staring at the doorway with wide, terrified eyes. "She's here," she whispered. "She's angry." Before I could respond, a loud crash came from the attic, followed by the sound of furniture being dragged across the floor. My blood ran cold. I knew I had to face whatever was in the attic. Armed with my flashlight and every ounce of courage I could muster, I climbed the stairs once more. The attic door was open, though I was certain I had locked it. Inside, the doll sat in its chair, but the air felt charged with energy, like a storm was about to break. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and I felt an invisible force pushing against me. "Leave us alone!" a voice screamed, childlike but distorted, filled with rage. The doll's head turned sharply toward me, and its glass eyes locked onto mine. I stumbled backward, my flashlight slipping from my hand. The attic filled with an icy wind, and the voice screamed again, "She's mine!" I don't remember much after that. When I came to, I was lying at the bottom of the attic stairs, with Evelyn standing over me. "You shouldn't have gone up there," she said softly, tears streaming down her face.
Hannah left the house the next day, refusing to stay another night. Evelyn died a week later, alone in her bed. When the house was cleared out, the attic was found sealed shut, the doll locked away once more. But strange things happened to the workers who cleared the house. Some said they heard humming and giggling coming from the attic, even though it was empty. Others claimed to see the doll's glass eyes glinting in the darkness. The house was eventually abandoned, its reputation keeping buyers away. To this day, it sits in silence, though locals swear they still hear faint whispers when they pass by. And at night, some say they see a small figure standing in the attic window, watching, waiting.
The Devil's Bargain. My name is Eric, and I've always considered myself a rational man. I never believed in ghosts, curses, or anything remotely supernatural. But after what happened last year, my view of the world and what exists in it has completely changed. This is the story of how one simple act of greed brought me face to face with something far beyond my understanding. It all started with an estate sale. I had recently gotten into the antique business, buying and flipping old items for a profit. Most weekends I scoured auctions and garage sales looking for hidden treasures. That's how I ended up at the old Peterson estate, a crumbling mansion on the edge of town. The place was being liquidated after its last owner passed away under unusual circumstances. As I wandered through the rooms, a small item in the corner of the study caught my eye. A doll. It was old and delicate, made of porcelain, with vibrant green glass eyes and a red ribbon tied in its hair. Something about it felt unique, valuable even. I didn't know at the time that it was more than just an antique. I bought the doll for next to nothing. No one else seemed interested in it. The auctioneer gave me a strange look as I handed him the money. "Are you sure you want that?" he asked. "It's got history." "Even better," I replied, already calculating the profit I'd make selling it to a collector. He shook his head and muttered something under his breath as I walked out. That night, I placed the doll in my home office, on a shelf near some other antiques I was cataloging. As I admired its craftsmanship, I noticed an inscription on the back of its neck, carved faintly into the porcelain. It read, "Do not break the pact." It was strange, but I didn't think much of it at the time. The first night, I woke to the sound of a thud coming from my office. Half asleep, I went to check and found the doll lying face down on the floor. I picked it up, inspecting it for damage, but it was intact. I put it back on the shelf and went to bed, dismissing the noise as the doll slipping off somehow. The next morning, I noticed something odd. The air in the office felt heavier, colder. The doll was still on the shelf, but its head seemed to be tilted slightly, as if it were looking at me. I chalked it up to my imagination and got on with my day. That evening, as I worked late cataloging other items, I felt an overwhelming sense of unease. It was like someone was standing behind me, watching. When I turned around, I swore I saw the doll's green eyes glint in the dim light, even though there was no sunlight to reflect off them. I shook it off and decided to go to bed, but as I reached for the light switch, I heard it. A soft, melodic voice whispering, "I can give you everything." I froze. My heart raced as I scanned the room, but I was alone. The voice came again, clearer this time. "We can make a deal." It was coming from the doll. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room staring at the doll from across the room. The voice didn't return, but I couldn't shake what I'd heard. Was I losing my mind? Or was there really something inside that doll? The next day, I called a friend who dabbled in the occult. When I described the doll, her voice grew serious. "Eric, you need to get rid of it," she said. "It's not just a cursed object, it's a vessel. Something's attached to it." "But it spoke to me," I said. "It offered me something." She was silent for a moment before replying, "That's how it starts. It offers you what you want most, but there's always a price. Don't listen to it." I wanted to believe her, but curiosity got the better of me. That night, I sat in front of the doll and spoke to it. "What are you offering?" I asked, feeling foolish. The room grew colder, and the voice returned. It was soft, sweet, but laced with something dark. "Wealth, power, anything you desire. All I ask is your trust." I didn't say yes that night, but the offer stayed with me. Over the next few days, my life began to spiral. Deals I had counted on for my business fell through. My car broke down, bills piled up. It was as if everything was crumbling around me. And every time I thought about the doll, the whisper echoed in my mind, "I can fix this." Desperate, I gave in. I placed the doll in front of me and said, "Fine, I accept your offer. What do I need to do?" The doll's eyes glinted, and for a moment I thought I saw its mouth move. The voice replied, "Nothing. I'll take care of the rest." At first, it seemed like the doll was keeping its promise. The next morning, I received a call about a huge sale I thought I'd lost. The buyer had changed their mind and offered me even more than I'd expected. Over the next few weeks, everything I touched seemed to turn to gold. My bank account grew, my reputation soared, and my life felt charmed. But then, the nightmares began. I dreamed of shadowy figures surrounding me, their hands reaching for my throat. I saw flashes of people I didn't know, their faces contorted in pain. Each morning, I woke up feeling weaker, drained, and every time I looked at the doll, its green eyes seemed brighter, more alive. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I smashed the doll with a hammer, shattering its porcelain face. But as soon as it broke, the room filled with an ear-piercing scream. The lights flickered, and the air turned icy. The shards of the doll began to move, reassembling themselves on the floor. In a matter of seconds, the doll was whole again, sitting upright with that same twisted grin. The voice returned, colder than ever. "You broke the pact. Now you're mine." That was months ago, and the doll hasn't left me since. It sits in the corner of my office, its green eyes watching my every move. My luck has turned to ash. Deals fall apart, clients vanish, and my health deteriorates by the day. I've tried everything to get rid of it, but it always comes back. I don't know how much longer I can last. The whispers are constant now, louder and more insistent. Sometimes I wake up with scratches on my arms, as if something is marking me. And in my dreams, the doll stands over me, whispering, "You belong to me." If you ever find yourself tempted by something that seems too good to be true, take my advice. Don't make the deal. No amount of wealth or power is worth the price.